We put a lot of trust in our systems of law and order, right? We expect them to protect us. But what happens when those very systems turn on the people they're supposed to be guarding? Today, we're exploring 3 cases from around the world where protectors became killers, and we're going to examine what happens when justice itself is put on trial. And that really is the central question we're looking at today. We're going to dive into 3 different stories where people died while in the custody of police or prison guards or even soldiers. The circumstances are all different, but the outcomes, well, they reveal a really unsettling pattern that connects them all. So our first case, it takes us to Germany. And this isn't what you might expect. Not some story about a back alley interrogation. This was a medical procedure sanctioned by the state, performed by a doctor, all to collect evidence. And it had a fatal outcome. So this is Lelay Alamakande. Back in 2004, police in Germany arrested him. They suspected he'd swallowed some small packets of cocaine to hide them. Now, instead of just, waiting for the evidence to pass naturally, they decided they were going to get it out by force. The truly horrifying thing about this whole procedure is just how cold and clinical it was. A doctor was called in, a tube was forced down Alamakande's nose and into his stomach, just so they could pump in this powerful vomiting agent. Of course he fought back. I mean, who wouldn't? And in that struggle, he started inhaling his own vomit. And even with that obvious sign of distress, they did it again. He collapsed, with foam coming from his mouth and nose. They managed to revive him, but it was too late. He fell into a coma and died 10 days later. The official cause of death was cerebral hypoxia, a technical term for a lack of oxygen to the brain. But let's be real, that bureaucratic language just hides a simple, brutal truth. He was drowned. And what's absolutely shocking is that this wasn't some one-off incident. In that one city alone, they used this procedure on over 1,000 people between 1991 and 2004. Now, the system did eventually react. In 2006, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that this practice was unequivocally torture. The doctor involved was ordered to pay a fine to Alamakande's family. So that case was about a medical procedure that turned deadly. But our next one, it shows how something as routine as a punishment can become an instrument of death itself. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and head over to the United States, specifically inside the psychiatric ward of a Florida prison. And here, a punishment for misbehavior was twisted into something that sounds like it's straight out of a medieval torture chamber. This man is Darren Rainey. He was 50 years old, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and was serving a pretty short sentence. So after an incident in his cell, guards took him to this specially modified shower. And the key thing you need to know about this shower is that the people locked inside, they had zero control over the water temperature. Rainey was locked inside that shower for almost 2 hours, and the water blasting down on him, it reached temperatures as high as 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 71 Celsius. We're talking hot enough to cause severe burns in just a matter of seconds. Other inmates could hear him screaming, just begging to be let out. When the guards finally opened that door, he was dead. The physical evidence was just horrific. His body was covered in burns. A paramedic at the scene actually reported that his skin was literally peeling away at the touch. And his hands, they were bruised from pounding on that door, desperately trying to escape. And yet, the official response? At first, just silence. It took years of reporting by the Miami Herald to even get an investigation started. The final outcome? The medical examiner ruled his death an accident, blaming his health problems and the confinement. Yeah, the warden was fired, but not a single person ever faced criminal charges for this. All right, for our final case, the setting changes again. We're going to a U.S. military detention center in Bagram, Afghanistan, during the early days of the War on Terror. And this is the story of a young man who was quite simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His name was Dilawar. He was a young taxi driver, and he got stopped at a checkpoint near a U.S. base that had just been attacked. The so-called evidence against him? It was flimsy at best, nothing more than a broken walkie-talkie. But that was enough. He was handed over to American soldiers, and it turned out to be a death sentence. The truly devastating irony here is that while Dilawar was being subjected to days of just brutal interrogation, many of the U.S. interrogators themselves started to believe he was innocent, just a cab driver who happened to pick up the wrong passengers. But the abuse didn't stop. It continued. He was chained by his wrists to the ceiling for days on end, his shoulders literally dislocating from the strain. He was deprived of sleep and repeatedly beaten with these powerful blows to the side of his leg, a technique the soldiers called peroneal strikes. He endured more than 100 of them. The damage to his legs was so extreme that Army doctors used a really shocking medical term to describe them: pulpified. They had literally been beaten into a mass of dead tissue. If he had somehow survived, his legs would have needed to be amputated. On his final day, his legs just wouldn't bend anymore. He was dragged back to his cell, chained to the ceiling one last time, and he died just hours later. So, okay, let's just pause for a second. We have 3 men, dead in 3 different countries, under 3 completely different systems of authority: a police station in Germany, a prison in America, and a U.S. military base in Afghanistan. So now let's try and connect the dots and see what pattern starts to emerge. This table, I think, really lays it all out with stark clarity. In every single case, a brutal death directly caused by the actions of people working for the state. And the outcome for those responsible? Well, in Germany, the doctor got a fine. In Florida, no criminal charges at all. And for the soldiers who beat Dilawar to death, just some minor punishments, like getting their rank reduced. In all 3 of these stories, not a single person was ever convicted of murder. So when you step back and look at these cases together, these common threads, they're just undeniable. In each story, the victim was dehumanized. They weren't seen as a person, but as a drug mule, a problem inmate, or a terrorist. Power was grossly, horribly abused. Official stories were cooked up, cerebral hypoxia, an accident, to hide the horrific reality. And in every single case, the system completely failed to deliver any kind of meaningful justice. And all of this brings us to the final, really tough question. These deaths weren't just caused by a few bad apples. No, they were the result of sanctioned procedures, official attitudes, and a culture of impunity that can grow inside these powerful institutions. So, when the very system that's designed to uphold the law is the perpetrator, who delivers justice? That's the question these stories force all of us to confront.